I saw her on a TV show, and I had never seen her before, and I said, that's it.
For more than 6 decades, Robert Redford was the definition of restraint. In an industry built on spectacle, scandal, and ego, he stood apart, not by shouting louder, but by choosing silence. He wasn't Hollywood's loudest voice. He was its calmest. He didn't feud. He didn't gossip. He didn't chase headlines or clap back in interviews. While others sparred in the press, Redford let the work speak. Film after film, he delivered performances etched into history. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, All the President's Men. He became the face of a different kind of stardom. Thoughtful, composed, unshakable. A gentleman in a business built on storms. But storms, even the quiet ones, leave scars. Now, at 88, the man who built a career on grace has chosen to break a lifelong pattern. Not for revenge, not for vanity, but for something simpler, truth. Because the reality behind the camera was never as golden as the frames we remember. And while Redford never raised his voice, he never forgot the friction. There were actors, great actors, who made the process unbearable. Not because of talent, but because of temperament. Not because of skill, but because of chaos. He's never named them. Until now. These aren't tabloid rumors. Together. 3 Days of the Condor, a 1975 political thriller, gave audiences a pairing that crackled with intelligence, danger, and intimacy. Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway. On screen, they were magnetic. Off screen, a completely different story. Redford has never denied Dunaway's brilliance. She was and is one of the most gifted actresses of her generation. But what audiences saw as chemistry was, in truth, tension barely disguised. She wasn't difficult because she cared, one crew member said years later. She was difficult because she didn't trust anyone, not even him. From the first day of filming, Redford could feel it. Dunaway arrived not as a collaborator, but as a battalion of one. Every line was up for debate. Every lighting setup questioned. Every note from the director was met with a counter-argument. Redford, who thrived on rhythm and intuition, found himself pulled into a creative tug-of-war that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with control. She would request rewrites the night before major scenes, ask for multiple takes to fine-tune the inflection of a single syllable, review dailies, challenge the emotional logic of her character, and sometimes demand lighting changes mid-shoot. At first, Redford tried to roll with it. He'd seen egos before. He understood intensity. But this wasn't intensity. It was siege. "We're not building a watch here," he reportedly muttered after a fourth reset on a minor scene. The tipping point came in a closed-door meeting with director Sidney Pollack. Dunaway, once again, was dissecting a scene meant to feel raw and urgent, an emotional pivot in a spy thriller. Redford sat quietly at first, until he snapped. "It's espionage, Faye, not Chekhov." The room went quiet. She walked out. The next day, she returned as if nothing had happened. But something had. The atmosphere never recovered. Their scenes together remained tight, charged, unforgettable. But that wasn't acting. That was restraint under pressure. That was a man gritting his teeth while the world mistook conflict for chemistry. Redford later described her as a storm in heels. Beautiful, commanding, impossible to ignore, but ultimately destructive to the process he held sacred. There were no public fallouts, no press feuds, just a quiet mutual understanding that they'd never work together again. Years later, when asked about Dunaway in an interview, Redford gave a thin smile and said just 2 words: "She's unforgettable." And she was. For all the wrong reasons. Gene Hackman was the kind of actor who didn't just enter a scene, he detonated it. Brilliant, intense, unrelenting. He didn't just perform, he attacked. Robert Redford respected that fire. He just couldn't work with it. Their only collaboration came early, during 1969's Downhill Racer, a gritty sports drama where the tension behind the camera nearly eclipsed what played out on screen. The film demanded precision, subtlety over spectacle. But Hackman wasn't built for that kind of quiet. From the very first rehearsal, the clash was clear. Redford approached each moment with care, rehearsed, layered, emotionally restrained. Hackman? He charged through scenes like a linebacker, rewriting cues, challenging the director, breaking rhythm with sheer force of personality. He's one of the greats, Redford once admitted, but he never cared who he steamrolled to get there. The production limped forward until one explosive incident cracked everything wide open. It was a pivotal emotional scene, quiet, introspective, built entirely on unspoken tension. But Hackman, frustrated with a lighting setup he felt was unflattering, refused to leave his trailer. For almost an hour, the crew waited. The director pleaded. Silence. Finally, Redford walked up to the trailer himself, opened the door, looked Hackman dead in the eye. "This isn't your movie, Gene," he said. "It's a team effort. Show up or step aside." Hackman showed up, but he never forgot the confrontation. Neither did Redford. From that day forward, they never spoke off camera again. In private, Redford referred to Hackman as a sledgehammer in a violin shop, undeniably powerful, but incapable of delicacy. Not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to yield. Directors became collateral damage. Co-stars were either ignored or bulldozed. Redford, a collaborator to his core, found it unbearable. He never denied Hackman's greatness. He just wanted no part of it. By the late 70s, Redford had begun producing his own projects. When Hackman's name appeared on casting lists, Redford would scribble 3 words in the margins: brilliant, not worth it. Their careers paralleled each other for decades. 2 titans of New Hollywood, both Oscar winners, both leading men, but never again on the same set, the same frame, or the same emotional wavelength. Asked years later if he regretted not working with Hackman again, Redford paused, then smiled, tight and controlled. "Some pairings," he said, "only need to happen once." On the surface, All the President's Men was a triumph of collaboration. 2 of the biggest stars of the 1970s, Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, playing journalists who cracked the Watergate scandal. A masterpiece of restraint, paranoia, and procedural drama. But the truth underneath, not nearly so seamless. Redford respected Hoffman's talent. He always had. But he found the process of working with him exhausting. Hoffman was electric, but unpredictable. Brilliant, but chaotic. He would rehearse a scene one way, then shoot it another. Change lines on the fly. Adjust blocking mid-take. Shift emotional tone without warning. To Redford, who built his performances on rhythm, planning, and trust, it felt less like collaboration and more like sabotage. There was one newsroom phone call scene where Hoffman reportedly did 7 takes, each with a different pacing, tone, and string of improvised dialogue. Redford, forced to react in real time, was said to be seething by the end. "He's chasing moments," Redford was overheard telling the director, "but we're trying to tell a story." The tension never boiled over publicly. No shouting matches, no headlines, but anyone on that set could feel the quiet friction. 2 stars orbiting the same center, on camera, but pulling in different directions when the lens stopped rolling. Hoffman wasn't malicious. He was instinctive, restless, always chasing spontaneity. But to Redford, who prized structure and narrative control, it felt careless. "You had to brace for impact," said one crew member. "Every scene was like stepping into a storm you couldn't predict." Redford never publicly criticized Hoffman. He didn't need to. His silence was louder. When asked years later why they never worked together again, Redford didn't hesitate. "Once was enough," he said. That was it. No elaboration, no shade, just a line drawn in permanent ink. Audiences still celebrate their performances. The movie remains a staple in journalism and film schools alike. But now, when you watch it closely, you might sense it. That quiet tension, the flicker of friction behind Redford's eyes. Not acting, just restraint. In the end, it wasn't a falling out. It was a realization. Some kinds of brilliance only work at a distance. And for Redford, once was more than enough. It's the name no one ever expected to hear on a list like this: Paul Newman. To the world, they were brothers. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting. Two legends, one myth, Redford and Newman. Cool blue charm and quiet fire. The perfect cinematic pairing. But according to Redford, the truth was more complicated. There was no fight, no betrayal, just a slow, quiet unraveling. Friendship slipping into formality, warmth fading into polite distance. "He was charming," Redford once said, "but he always kept a distance, and sometimes he played dumb to get away with more than he should have." The first cracks appeared during The Sting. Redford began to notice changes, small at first, then harder to ignore. Newman, now wielding producer power, started showing up to meetings with studio execs in tow, offering script notes, pushing for casting input, weighing in on camera angles. Redford, still focused on craft over politics, felt himself being edged out. The set, once easy and collaborative, began to feel strategic, calculated. "It stopped being two guys making a movie," one crew member recalled. "It became a chess match between stars." Redford kept his frustration private, but those close to him saw the toll. He admired Newman, always had, but he also resented how the public made Newman the face of their partnership, and Redford the quiet footnote. In interviews, journalists would direct questions to Newman first. Headlines leaned on Newman's name. "Paul was the face," Redford once said, "and I was the footnote." The dynamic wasn't toxic. It was just disappointing. A slow erosion of trust that no one saw coming. There were no shouting matches, no grand rupture, just silence. Scripts were floated over the years, potential reunions, nostalgic sequels, but nothing ever came of them. When asked why they never made another film together, Redford always offered the same line. The timing wasn't right, but those who knew the truth understood. Timing wasn't the problem. Trust was. They would appear together in public now and then. Fundraisers, tributes, the occasional shared smile. But it was never the same. And maybe that's the real heartbreak. That something so iconic, so beloved, was never as close as we all believed. Because sometimes, the most painful break isn't loud. It's the friendship that fades so slowly. You don't notice it's gone until it's too late. They never shared a screen. But Robert Redford didn't need a movie to know what working with James Woods would be like. A few casting room encounters were enough, and they told him everything. Woods was a known quantity in Hollywood circles. Brilliant, yes, but volatile, combative, unpredictable. And to Redford, who built his career on quiet, focused precision, that kind of energy wasn't a creative asset. It was a threat. They crossed paths during the casting phase of two different Redford-led projects in the late 80s and early 90s. Woods read for supporting roles, courtroom dramas, political thrillers. On paper, he was perfect. In person, he was chaos. One session started normally. Woods read a scene with razor-sharp timing, a performance that had everyone in the room holding their breath. And then, he stopped, mid-read, tossed the script aside, and launched into a lecture on Vietnam, Cold War policy, and the moral decay of Hollywood storytelling. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a discussion. It was a monologue. Redford, stunned, let him go for about 2 minutes before quietly closing his folder and walking out. Later, he was overheard saying, "If I wanted a debate, I'd go back to college." To Redford, Woods wasn't a collaborator. He was a disruption. Not just because of politics, but because of posture. He brought chaos to places that needed quiet, Redford said. "I wasn't interested in managing that energy." It wasn't a feud. There was no confrontation. Just a decision. And it was final. On casting notes, Redford reportedly wrote a single phrase next to Woods' name. Never. Ever. Over the years, Woods took subtle jabs at Redford, calling out Hollywood hypocrites who preach peace but run studios like generals. He never used Redford's name, but the target was obvious to those in the know. Redford never responded. He didn't need to. The blacklist was silent, complete, and irreversible. Woods' career would go on to attract more headlines than accolades, but Redford's phone never rang again. The door stayed closed. Sometimes the roles that never happen say more than the ones that do. On paper, it looked like a dream pairing. Robert Redford and Tom Cruise, two generations of Hollywood royalty, joining forces for a serious political drama. But from the first day of Lions for Lambs, it was clear. They weren't making the same movie. Redford came in with a vision, stripped down, introspective, built on restraint. He wanted to make a film about institutional failure, quiet courage, and the human cost of politics. Cruise came in with a different vision, one shaped by global markets, image consultants, and the expectations of a brand, not a character. He spoke in language I didn't recognize, Redford later said. Market positioning, global optics, viewer perception. Even rehearsals felt off. Cruise reportedly brought stylists to blocking sessions. He wanted his silhouette to communicate discipline. Redford wanted it to communicate vulnerability. It wasn't collaboration, it was collision. As a co-producer, Cruise pushed for changes, scene adjustments, lighting tweaks, alternate line readings. He stopped takes to suggest new angles or ask for a punchier delivery. Redford, famously patient, tried to absorb it all, until he couldn't. One day, in the middle of a tense exchange over a character beat, Redford leaned in and asked, calmly but coldly, "Are we acting, or are we selling a campaign ad?" The room went still. The divide was no longer creative. It was philosophical. Even in post-production, the clash continued. Cruise lobbied for tighter edits of his reaction shots, debated poster design, argued for changes in the final cut. The studio, eager to keep their star happy, sided with Cruise. That was the final straw. Redford delivered the film, skipped the press tour, and never spoke of it again. The movie underperformed. Cruise moved on. Redford went quiet. But the experience left a scar, one not born of ego, but of disappointment. To Redford, acting was about story. To Cruise, it seemed, acting had become about image. They were speaking two different dialects of the same language, said one insider, and neither one could translate. They never worked together again. No reunions, no callbacks. Sometimes, the hardest breakup isn't personal, it's philosophical. By the time The Natural began filming in the early 1980s, Robert Redford had become more than a star. He was a craftsman. Every gesture, every breath, every pause in his performance was intentional. He approached his role as Roy Hobbs like a symphony, measured, layered, precise. Enter Robert Duvall, a master of instinct, unpredictability, and improvisation. To Redford, Duvall was like jazz, wild, brilliant, but impossible to follow. At first, the contrast felt intriguing. Redford admired Duvall's rawness, the way he made every line feel alive. But that admiration didn't last. Duvall, playing cynical sports writer Max Mercy, would frequently rewrite dialogue in the makeup chair. He'd shift scenes without warning, alter emotional tones mid-take, and improvise lines that completely undercut the rhythms Redford had spent days refining. One scene, meant to deliver a critical emotional beat, turned into a standoff. Redford had worked with the director, Barry Levinson, to craft a very specific arc. A moment of quiet realization, subtle tension, and personal resolve. But every take, Duvall disrupted it, cracking jokes, inserting sarcasm, stealing the gravity from the moment. Finally, Redford stopped mid-scene, turned to Duvall, and said, "It's not your movie." Duvall snapped back, "It's not anyone's until it's real." What followed was 15 minutes of silence, argument, and dead air while the cameras rolled, but no one dared speak. Crew members backed away. One technician later said, "It felt like watching a symphony rehearsal dissolve into a bar fight." They finished the scene. Barely. Afterward, Redford was done. "He wanted to play jazz," he said. "I wanted to play composition. It wasn't music. It was noise." They never worked together again. No reunions, no reconciliations, just distance. It wasn't that Redford disliked Duvall as a person. He simply couldn't work with the chaos, couldn't sacrifice the architecture of his craft to the whims of another man's gut. Sometimes, even greatness is incompatible. So why now? Why would Robert Redford, ever composed, ever discreet, finally speak? Because time clarifies what youth conceals. At 88, Redford no longer needs to protect reputations. Not out of malice, but out of legacy. These weren't feuds. They were fractures, hairline cracks in the illusion of perfect collaboration. And every one of them left a mark. Redford didn't seek drama. He sought discipline, a sacred space where art could breathe, uninterrupted by ego, by chaos, by games. And when that space was violated, he remembered. Not to punish, but to learn. He never raised his voice. He never named names, until now. And even then, he didn't call it hate. What he felt was something deeper. Disappointment. In people. In process. In the myth of harmony that so often disguises creative war. He gave us legends. But behind every legend was a cost. Some of these names hurt. Others feel inevitable. But together, they show us the man behind the myth. Not a perfect gentleman, but a disciplined artist who demanded more than just greatness. He demanded grace. And maybe that's what hurts the most. Because for all the sunshine on screen, Redford's Hollywood had shadows too.